Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Beth Lewis, and I'm the director of the School of Kinesiology, and I'm honored to welcome you all to the Tucker Center's Fall Distinguished Lecture. As a member of the school's faculty and someone who does research in the area of gender and physical activity, I've worked closely with Tucker Center faculty and staff. In fact, Professor Mary Jo Kane, the center's director, hired me as an assistant professor in 2007. Thank you. I can therefore speak firsthand about the importance of this groundbreaking interdisciplinary research center, the first and only one of its kind in the nation, dedicated to exploring how sport and physical activity make a real difference in the lives of girls and women, their families, and communities. One important way they make a difference is connecting their research to issues that impact people's lives on a daily basis. One highly visible way this is done is through their annual Fall Distinguished Lecture, where they examine the most significant and sometimes most controversial issues in U.S. society. The center's work hits home for me as I raised my own daughter. I grew up playing pickup hockey with my brothers in outdoor rinks, but never had the opportunity to play hockey as a formal sport. Thanks to Title IX, my daughter at the age of 8 already has a 4-year, somewhat distinguished career in hockey and gets the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of her hockey-loving older brothers. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Jo Kane, Director of the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport. Professor Kane received her PhD from the University of Illinois with an emphasis in sports psychology and is an internationally recognized scholar who has published extensively on issues related to sport and gender, particularly media representations of women's sports. Professor Kane is the recipient of the first endowed chair in the nation related to women in sport, the Dorothy McNeil Tucker Chair for Women in Sport and Exercise Science. She has been elected by her peers to become a fellow in the National Academy of Kinesiology, the highest academic honor in her field, and is the past recipient of the Scholar of the Year Award from the Women's Sport Foundation. In 2016, Professor Kane was named one of the 100 most influential sports educators by the Institute for International Sport. She has appeared on the Today Show and has had research cited in numerous media outlets, most notably the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Jo Kane.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. I can say without hesitation that she is one of the best hires that I have ever made. Before I begin my formal remarks tonight regarding the panel, I want to first acknowledge the passing of our founder and benefactor, Dr. Dorothy McNeil Tucker, who passed away last August. As many of you know, without her vision and commitment, the Tucker Center would not be here. Speaking of an extraordinary commitment to the work we do, I also want to publicly acknowledge the support we have received over the last 2 decades from the Mueller family, most notably Mike Mueller and her daughter, Carrie Fritzie, who are also here tonight. The Edith Mueller Park and Recreation Memorial Award was established by the late Dr. Van Mueller and his wife, Dr. Mike Mueller, to permanently provide through scholarships a fitting tribute to the vitality and passion of their daughter, Edith Irene Mueller, a student in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies from 1979 until her untimely death in 1982. Every year during our fall lecture, we name this year's awards recipient. And I would now like to call to the stage Stephen Lipovitsky. Stephen is a recreation administration major in the School of Kinesiology. He is from Hopkins, Minnesota, and is a first-generation Russian. He is passionate about recreation and the benefits it has for all of our communities. He is particularly committed to helping people achieve their physical and mental health goals, as well as encouraging a lifelong healthy lifestyle. He is currently working in the university's Recreation Wellness Center as a fitness coordinator, and he's also involved with fitness business consulting and sings in an a cappella group called Bases Wild. Very, very clever. I also want to acknowledge that his father is sitting here tonight, so how about a really big, warm applause? We also couldn't succeed in the Tucker Center without the ongoing support of so many, but I want to especially thank and acknowledge our dean, Jean Quam, who has been an early and often supporter of the Tucker Center. Finally, I want to acknowledge members of the Tucker team who have worked so hard behind the scenes to make this event tonight a success. Mateo Wasson, Caroline Heffernan, Mitzi Sallow, Courtney Boucher, Jonathan Sweet, and the person who has quarterbacked many of the key details tonight, our PhD student, Anna Baith. How about a warm round of applause for the Tucker team? The Tucker Center has a threefold mission. It's to conduct research that impacts the lives of girls and women, to provide first-rate educational opportunities for students, and to engage in community outreach and public service. Our Distinguished Lecture Series brings all part of that mission together by creating a forum that allows the best and the brightest to share their insights, knowledge, and experiences on the most important and timely issues in the sports world. The notion of most timely has an interesting background when it comes to tonight's lecture. Several years ago, one of my former PhD students, Dr. Austin Calhoun, suggested that we examine the issue of transgender student athletes for our distinguished lecture. Given that her idea did not come to fruition until 2017, I think speaks volumes about a number of things, most notably that Tucker Center graduate students are not only really smart and courageous, but way ahead of the curve when it comes to example, the Tucker Center's director, meaning yours truly, because I vetoed that idea. But it also speaks to something else. A dear friend and colleague introduced me to a Greek word and concept called kairos, which translates as time, but not in the literal sense. It means taking advantage of or even creating a well-timed moment to deliver an important societal message, one that is finally able to break through after decades of suppression and denial, and enter into our public discourse in ways that can be discussed and understood, if not totally embraced. I suggest that our panel tonight embodies kairos, where, and I'm quoting, circumstances align in ways that open moments of opportunity for social change. What exactly are those circumstances that provide such moments of opportunity? In 2015, Olympic Decathlon gold medal winner Bruce Jenner announced her gender transition to Caitlyn Jenner. This unprecedented cultural moment created a public dialogue about what it means to be transgender and how such definitions challenge our very notions of biological sex, gender, sexuality, and athletic participation. More than any other institution, sport is seen and practiced as a highly gendered activity. We have women's sports and men's sports, and never shall that gendered binary be crossed. So what does it mean then when someone who has been identified at birth as female transitions to being and living as male, and vice versa? And how do such realities challenge and disrupt our sporting enterprise? To help us answer all of these questions and many more, I'm going to introduce to you tonight our moderator, and that is Dr. Nicole Lavoie, who is also the Tucker Center co-director. Dr. Lavoie is a senior lecturer in the social and behavioral sciences in the School of Kinesiology. She is a leading scholar on sport and gender, and has recently emerged as the leading expert on occupational employment patterns in women's sports in the wake of Title IX. An internationally sought-after scholar and educator, Dr. Lavoie speaks to a variety of stakeholders, policymakers, and advocates of and for female athletes. She serves on the national advisory boards of the Women's Sports Foundation, ESPNW, and the Alliance of Women Coaches. And she, too, is one of the best hires I have ever made. Please join me in giving a Minnesota welcome to a Minnesota native, Dr. Nicole Lavoie.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Welcome, everyone. We've got a few people trickling in, plenty of seats in the front. Welcome to what I know is going to be a very informative and insightful evening together. as Dr. Kane indicated, we are currently experiencing an unprecedented cultural moment around visibility and awareness of transgender individuals in our community. Public dialogue around the rights of transgender individuals within nearly every social institution, including our military, political and legal systems, to educational, occupational context, is commonplace, and sport is no exception. Specific to our conversation tonight is how the institution of sport and our commonly held and rigid notions and practices of gender, sex, and athletic participation is being challenged and transformed by transgender individuals. Perhaps more than any other social institution, sport is popular, highly visible, and constructed, as Dr. Kane mentioned, as a gendered binary, meaning we have women's sports and men's sports. We have girls' sports and boys' sports. Early in the 1990s, Dr. Kane, in a seminal piece of her scholarship, which some of the students in the audience have probably read, challenged this rigid and socially constructed idea of the sport as a binary, as male and female, as masculine and feminine. And she argued, rather, that sport participation and who got to play on what team be based on a continuum of ability and performance that is fair and just and provides visibility and opportunity for everybody. Today, 25 years later, little did Dr. Kane know that her sport continuum would be relevant and applicable to the current discussion about fairness, social justice, and inclusion of transgender athletes. The key point for the purpose of our panel tonight is that sex-segregated sport is inherently problematic for those who do not fit neatly into this binary, including transgender individuals, gender nonconforming individuals, and for intersex individuals. What is important to grasp tonight, and we are all here to learn and become more familiar with this terminology and landscape, is that sex and gender are not binaries. They are continua. And many individuals identify and live in the middle, in the reality along these continua, between the binaries of male and female and masculine and feminine. At every level of sport, from local to national, from youth to the Olympics, pioneering transgender athletes are challenging and transforming what it means to play and compete. And for those who oversee sports, they are developing and implementing policies that determine who can play on which teams and under what circumstances. And the scholars are scrambling to study this emerging field. This is complex and contested terrain. So tonight, our Tucker Center Distinguished Lecture features a panel of experts and really amazing people who will discuss these complexities from a variety of perspectives. So at this time, I'd like to now invite our distinguished panelists and amazing people to the stage. Please help me welcome them. So I will now introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Brent Dara, whose preferred gender pronouns are he, his. Brent graduated from Bowling Green State University with a sport management major while competing for 3 years as a student athlete. For 2 of the 3 years he competed, he was a member of the women's cross country and track teams. During this time, he came out as transgender and began medically transitioning while competing as a member of the men's cross country and track teams. Brent broke many barriers as he became the first transgender athlete in collegiate cross country and track at Bowling Green, as well as in the Mid-American Conference. He is currently pursuing his master's in sport administration at Bowling Green. Welcome, Brent.
Thank you.
Our second distinguished panelist is Heidi Janes, whose preferred gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. Heidi is in her 19th year as the head volleyball coach at Carleton College, where she has achieved numerous volleyball accolades as a coach. At Carleton, she is also a professor of physical education, athletics, and recreation, and is an associate athletics director. Many roles. And she took time out of her busy schedule in season to be with us here tonight. In her athletics administrator role, she was instrumental in creating and chairing Carleton's Equity Committee, which authored the school's first transgender policy. And since, the policy has widely been adopted throughout the region by other institutions in the conference and around the area. We appreciate the insight your coaching and administrative expertise will bring to the panel tonight for this important topic. Welcome. Last, but certainly not least, we welcome Dr. Vicki Crane, whose preferred gender pronouns are she, her. Dr. Crane is a professor of teaching excellence in the School of Human Movement, Sport, and Leisure Studies at Bowling Green State University, where she is also an affiliated faculty member with Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. In her scholarship, Dr. Crane examines sex, gender, and sexuality within a sport context. Her current research focuses on intersex, transgender, and lesbian athletes, topics which she has authored numerous, and when I say numerous, I mean that, journal articles and book chapters, and given a number of keynote and invited lectures on LGBT sports people. Professor Crane's work has recently been recognized when she received the Excellence in Diversity Award from the College of Education and Human Development at BGSU. Welcome, Dr. Crane, and to all our panelists. Before we begin the panel discussion, which is going to be amazing, we all felt on our conference call when we were talking about the panel is that it was important to start with some common understandings and language and terminology and concepts related to transgender individuals, as there are likely various levels of knowledge and understanding in the audience. And we're all here to learn and about this emerging topic, and to facilitate growing our knowledge base is Dr. Crane.
First, I just want to take a moment and just say thank you to the co-directors of the Tucker Center, Dr. Lavoie, Dr. Kane, for inviting me and all of us to be part of this panel. Dr. Lewis, thank you. And to the graduate students who I know have done a lot of work in helping organize this, I appreciate all of your efforts to bring us here. The Tucker Center is just an amazing entity, and it's just at the forefront of scholarship and advocacy for girls and women in sport, and to be a part of it even for an evening is just a thrill and an honor. So thank you for having me here. With that, I'm going to jump into just to get us all on the same page in terms of some of the terminology that we're really used to using, and make sure that we're all kind of following on the same path here. Am I going the right way? Other way. There we go. We all have a gender identity and a gender expression, but we often don't stop to think about what that means. And generally speaking, your gender identity is how you feel as, do I identify myself, do I feel that I'm a female, I'm a male, I'm transgender, I'm something else, somewhere in between. But you have this internal sense of how you feel, and so we identify as that. Our expression is how we present ourselves to others. The clothing we wear, your hairstyle, how you talk, your general mannerisms. So we all express our gender in a number of ways. But I think what's really important to recognize is to distinguish between sex and gender, because we often kind of conflate the two of them. When we're talking about sex, we're talking about the biological, the physical body, your anatomy, your chromosomes, your physiology. What does your body tell you? How is it described? And we usually look at that in terms of male and female, and the binary that both Dr. Lavoie and Dr. Kane were talking about. Gender is tended to think about in terms of as it's culturally, socially constructed, in that that's how we learn to be masculine, how we learn to be feminine. So young boys learn really early that this is what boys do and how to be a boy, and young girls learn to play with dolls and be feminine. And for most people, it's more common that your sex, your gender identity, and your gender expression all fall into line, and you're a male, masculine, identify as that, express yourself as that. And that's what we're used to, and that's what, for decades, for generations, that's how people have been thought to be. And we're clearly recognizing that there's a lot of middle ground in all of that, and that for a lot of people, that doesn't line up so nice and neatly. And hence, that's why we're here to talk particularly about transgender people who don't necessarily fall into what we've tended to think of in terms of sex and gender. When we talk about a transgender person, we're usually thinking in terms of someone who the sex they were assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. And we're finding that kids, as soon as they can talk, are sometimes saying, like, no, Mom and Dad, you have this wrong. I'm not a boy, I'm a girl, and vice versa. So it's an identity. They recognize it very early, and sometimes it's not till later in life that either it's recognized or expressed, as in the case of Caitlyn Jenner. Obviously, that happened much later in life. There's like no single path here, and you're going to hear probably all of us talk about that there's a lot of different ways of being transgender. Some other terms that might come up and that you might hear. Someone who is cisgender, again, we tend to think what we see most often. So we tend to think that, well, transgender people are different because their gender identity and their sex at birth don't match. But we all have a gender identity. So cisgender recognizes people who their gender identity is consistent with how they were born, with how they were assigned at birth, their sex. So that term has gotten much more popular, and you're starting to hear that more often now, to recognize that everybody has a gender identity. A genderqueer person, sometimes we hear the term, they're non-binary, gender fluid. There's a variety of different terms that people might use. And usually when someone identifies that way, they don't want to put themselves into a box. They don't feel male, they don't feel female, they don't want to call themselves transgender. Sometimes they're fluid and their gender expression and identity shifts. Sometimes they just don't feel like I fit in a box and they don't want to label themselves. So you might hear those terms used. And as we talk in terms of some of the policy and experiences, you'll see very often it's harder to, sometimes they don't feel that they fit in to what, in particular in sport, you have to be a male or a female to compete. And how do we work with people that fall somewhere in between there? And again, a lot of that is where we're going tonight. And then you also hear the term intersex, which is not what we're talking about tonight, but just to make sure that we're clear that that's different from transgender. Someone who is intersex is born with either ambiguous anatomy, genitalia, or potentially they have some male characteristics and some female characteristics. And it reminds us that when we talk about sex, in nature, it is more than just male and female. There is a continuum. There are people that are just naturally different than the average person, and that we need to keep that in mind. But again, that's different than someone who's transgender, and I do some writing on that, and if you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk to you. It's a whole other presentation later during the reception. When we talk to transgender people, and when we talk to ourselves, we all have pronouns that we use, and we were introduced with our pronouns to make the point that it's important to recognize that and to recognize people how they want to be recognized. And we're used to, and we're all familiar with the he, him, his, male, the she, her, hers, female. They, them, theirs is sometimes used by people as a singular because it's inclusive, it's not gender labeled. So some people prefer to just have a completely gender neutral and use those terms. We'll also see people, there's a transgender movement that's created their own pronouns that they feel comfortable using. And that might be z, her, hers. We also see z, zer, zim. It sounds like there's a lot to toss out here, and it's a little bit confusing the first time you're hearing it. The easiest thing to do is simply ask someone, what pronouns do you prefer, and then just start getting in the habit of using them. So these are, you'll hear us use various different pronouns, and in your readings about transgender people, you will see various different pronouns as people identify themselves differently. I also want to talk about the process of transitioning, and I'm not going to go into any detail other than to point out kind of the general overview of each of them, the types of transitioning. And there's different components of it. And again, it's not necessarily they have to do things in a certain order, but one component of transitioning from male to female or vice versa, female to male, is what's called a social transition. And when that happens, people change the names they prefer to use, the pronouns they prefer to use. They might change their outward expression, how they dress, how they wear their hair. But they're shifting from being perceived as one gender to being perceived how they feel and what matches their gender identity. Hormonal transition occurs when people start taking cross-gender hormones. Very often, either testosterone therapy or testosterone suppression therapy. And what we see in young kids, we're starting to see kids doing puberty suppression so that if they identify as transgender before puberty, they don't have to go through those bodily changes, which if you don't feel comfortable in that type of a body, you don't want it to get more mature. And we're starting to see pretty much the first generation of children, trans children, that have been on puberty suppression, and we're still learning a lot about that. I'm fortunate to have a good friend who's an endocrinologist that helps me understand this. So, and even that, we're still in the very early stages of understanding this. And some transgender people will choose to have surgeries to change their body even more than hormones will change them. And actually, what's called top surgery, so either breast reduction or augmentation. Bottom surgery is surgery to genitalia. Some people might have some types of cosmetic surgery. But what's really important in all of this, there's no one way to do this. Some trans people will have no body changes and just how they present themselves. Some will go through hormone therapy. Some might have some surgery. Some might have a complete gender reassignment or gender confirmation surgery. And truly, there can be any combination. So what we're seeing, the transgender population is very diverse, and what people choose to do to their bodies and to themselves is really what's comfortable for them. Sometimes it comes down to finances, sometimes it comes down to access, sometimes it just comes down to what their identity is comfortable with. So I'm going to leave us at that as kind of an introduction to the terminology that we'll be using this evening.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Ray.
This back.
Yeah. Okay. That was a good tutorial for me, and I'm sure many in the room. So thank you for providing some really key foundational concepts that will help frame our understanding and discussion tonight. So I would invite everybody after the panel is complete and we're done for the night. We have snacks in the lobby, but we also have a lot of resources on the table, scholarly articles that Dr. Crane has put together, resources, reports, websites, groups around transgender individuals and trans athletes in particular. So we've compiled a lot of stuff if this is an area of interest. If you want to read some of Dr. Crane's articles, we have those up outside. So to start, Brent, out of all of us on the stage, you have the lived experience. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
All right, and so as I was thinking about how to talk about this, I figured it'd probably be best to kind of go in sort of a timeline type of fashion because there were a lot of things that happened. My transition was not just like a 1-year process. Changed my name, started hormones, it's over with, yay, great. It was a multiple year process. It took me a very long time, even just to kind of come to terms with my identity in the first place. So I guess just to give some background before I start talking about my actual transition within athletics. Growing up, I had a younger brother. We were very close, and I absolutely was a tomboy as a kid. I never liked anything feminine, never really wanted to be part of anything feminine. My parents got me Barbies when I was a kid, and I would just like rip their heads off because I was like, yeah, I'm not a big fan of this sort of thing. And so just growing up, before puberty and all that sort of thing, I absolutely was a tomboy and had no interest in doing anything feminine. As I got in to puberty and kind of my early years of high school, I really started to dislike myself for a lot of reasons. Menstruation, not something I was a fan of. And I kind of felt like I got gypped. I was like, why is it that I have to do this? Well, my brother gets to, he gets facial hair, he gets to have muscles, and, gets to do this other cool stuff, and I have to bleed. Like, what's the story with that one? So I wasn't a big fan of that. And so just kind of going through puberty in general was a really uncomfortable time for me. Obviously, for a lot of people, it's never a good time anyways. But I just, there was this period of time where I honestly just, like, really loathed myself as a person. And I felt like, maybe people don't like puberty, but I probably shouldn't be hating myself. Like, there's probably a reason why I'm hating myself. And so my parents are pretty conservative people, and there wasn't really a lot of room for me to kind of explore those feelings for a long time. And I eventually kind of accepted the fact that I was a lesbian, and I was like, okay, well, maybe it's just like my sexuality, and I really just kind of disliked myself because I couldn't like accept the fact that I liked girls or whatever. And so I was like, yeah, that's probably the issue, and so I can just kind of go on about my life now. So as I got kind of into my sophomore, junior year of high school, I was still really kind of hating myself, and I was like, sexuality, that was part of the equation. Obviously, I felt good about the fact that I was able to find a sexuality that kind of I was like able to identify with, but I was still really hating myself and my body and my changes. And so I kind of started to do some research to see if there were other people out there that felt the same way that I did about myself. And that's kind of when I came across the word transgender, and I had never heard of that before. It was a new concept to me. But I had heard of people getting sex changes, so I was like, okay, interesting. So this was, probably 2011, 2012, where trans people were just kind of becoming a visible thing. They were still pretty hidden in society. But I decided to do a little bit of research. I looked up some videos on YouTube, tried to find other trans men to see their experiences, to see if I could figure out whether or not this was an identity that perhaps I would later, come to embrace. And so I sat on it for a long time. I watched a lot of videos, and I was like, a lot of these things that they're talking about, that they're explaining, seem kind of relevant to my own life and what I'm experiencing. I didn't cling to the identity right away, but I certainly kept it at the forefront of my mind and felt like, yeah, there's a possibility that this could be my reality. And so I graduated high school in 2013 and started college at BG. And when I left home, moved into my dorm that same day, I was like, yep, got a haircut. Only wore men's clothing from that point. My parents were not too excited about that, but that's too bad for them. I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And so just being able to kind of present in a more masculine fashion helped me feel a little bit better about myself anyways. But I had not forgotten about the fact that potentially I could be trans. So for almost my entire freshman year, I actually identified continually as a female, reluctantly. Secretly, I enjoyed it when people would mistake me and say things like sir or bud or pal, and I was like, oh yeah, that's a good feeling. And so it was kind of key moments like that where I felt that just, maybe identifying as female is wrong, because it had started to feel wrong, especially after I changed my image to feel a little bit better about myself. And so March of my freshman year, so this is 2014, I began the social transition that Dr. Crane had mentioned earlier. I started telling people that I wanted to go by Brent instead of the female name that I had previously gone by, and to go ahead and use male pronouns instead. And so at the time, I was on the women's cross-country and track teams, and so I had to come out to my team, the men's team as well, just because we're so close and we travel a lot together and do a lot of things together, they had to know as well. And so shortly after that point, I ended up coming out to them. They were extremely accepting. BG is a pretty liberal school, if you don't know anything about it, so the administration helped a lot with that. So it was me, the coaches, and a few people from the administration. We sat down during one of our team meetings that we had, and we just kind of went ahead and let everybody know. And so everybody was, like I said, very cool about it. No one gave me a hard time. Everybody tried their very best to change the name and pronouns as quickly as they could and make it as comfortable for me as they could. So from that point, it was really just a waiting game. You can't just waltz into any doctor's office and be like, hey, sign me up with some testosterone. I'm trying to transition here. It doesn't work like that. So I had to have I had 2 meetings with a gender therapist later. So at the end of 2014, around November and December, I met with a gender therapist twice to confirm that I was, in fact, ready to start hormones. He wrote me a referral, and in January 2015, I officially started taking testosterone. From that point, I was officially ineligible to compete on any women's team. And so for me, that was a little bit of a difficult time, just because they are what I had known right from the beginning, and I didn't really want to give that up. And I was kind of in this weird limbo stage where I was still practicing with the women's team, but I was not competing with them. So I wasn't ready to compete with the men yet. They offered the suggestion. Some of the trainers were like, hey, you started taking testosterone, you can compete with the men. And I was like, girl, no. It is too soon for that. I am not ready for that yet. It takes a long time. I mean, it's a puberty. Although it's an accelerated puberty, you don't just take one thing of testosterone and, all right, the next day you're ready to go. It's taken me years. It'll actually be 3 years for me in January. So it's taken some time. And so from that point, it was a little bit weird. So the spring of 2015 was kind of hard for me. I felt like I didn't really belong to either team just because I was, like I said, kind of in that weird stage of not eligible for the women's team, wasn't ready for the men's team. I took that summer to really kind of try to prepare myself physically to run with the men's team that upcoming fall. So that was going to be my junior year. It was hard. I was really asking a lot out of my body, and it was tough for me just to still try to fit in because I went from full-time on the women's team to just right into the men's team. And obviously they were cool. We were good friends. I mean, obviously we traveled a lot together. We went, to the same place. We saw each other at practice. So it's not like I didn't know them. I did, but once again, just harder, especially since I was socialized as a female. I lived as a female for nearly 20 years. So socialization with women was just easier for me. Most of my friends to this day are still females, just because it's what I know. And so to just try to feel like I wasn't disrupting their team dynamic and to feel like I wasn't an outsider was hard, even though they were accepting. And certainly the caliber of competition is much higher at a men's level. It was very difficult for me to go from consistently a top finisher on the women's team to absolutely dead last on the men's team by every stretch. We'd be running casually and for the women's team, we'd practice at like a 7-minute pace. That was like pretty chill and easy. The guys would sometimes run at like a 6:30, and I'm like, all right, this is pushing it a little bit here. This is not something I'm used to. So I think for me, just trying to realize that there was a lot that I had to kind of overcome in terms of physically changing, other than just the social changes I had to go through. I mean, it was a lot to ask out of my body, and I only chose to remain on the men's team for 1 year simply because I was asking too much out of myself. It takes a long time for your body to adjust to the hormone changes. I went from high levels of estrogen and low levels of testosterone to vice versa. I took several visits for the first year of my medical transition to my endocrinologist to make sure that my levels were within a reasonable range because I was tired. I mean, it's essentially a second puberty. I mean, of course, if we all can remember what puberty was like, I mean, it's not great the first time around. Certainly wasn't any better the second time. I mean, I appreciated the changes a little bit more just because they were what I was looking for, but it didn't make it any easier. And so just asking that much out of my body, trying to be a Division I athlete, being a runner, and then just trying to compete at a higher level was certainly very difficult for me. So I ended up I never officially competed on the men's team. I never actually raced as a male athlete, but I did train with them for a year before I officially decided in March 2016. Can't do it anymore. I was heartbroken. I was devastated that I had to quit my sport just because it's what I loved. I absolutely loved being the best peak physical condition I possibly could have been as an athlete, but it was time for me to move on to other things. And so I chose formally to quit. So it was difficult, but I needed to do what was best for my body, and that was so I could focus on my transition a little bit better and not be so run down all the time. But throughout this entire experience, the administration at BGSU was absolutely fantastic. Like Dr. Lavoie said, I was the first transgender athlete at my school and in my conference and in my sport. So although the NCAA instituted a policy in 2011 to allow transgender athletes to compete, it wasn't quite as easy as, okay, great, you're on the men's team now. I just write a proposal to the NCAA to allow them to give me permission basically to compete on the men's team because testosterone is a banned substance by the NCAA. So I'd write them a letter and wait for their approval before I was officially allowed to actually compete with the men or run with the men. I had to write a letter to the athletic director and request that I was allowed to go ahead and run on a different team. There was just a lot of eligibility pieces that made it difficult. So it wasn't just a very quick transition. There was a lot of behind the scenes work too. And so I just, I don't think my experiences would have been the same had BGSU not been as open-minded as they were, just because I was the first person to go through this. They absolutely listened to me. I had several meetings with multiple administrators just wanting to hear me out because they're like, hey, we don't know, so what are you looking for out of this? How can we cater to you? How can we help you? And I was a scholarship athlete as well on the women's team. And there is really hardly any scholarship opportunities on the men's team. There is no men's track and field team. There's only men's cross country. And so they graciously actually let me keep my scholarship as well. They did not have to do that. But like I said, we kind of played everything by ear here, just going off of what the NCAA policy had. So we kind of just worked together and laid things out, and it was very successful. I've always been extremely grateful for the people that were part of that sort of thing. And my hope is always that other schools cater to their athletes, whether they're transgender or anyone LGBTQ in any respect, simply because had they not been that considerate and that helpful with me through my transition, I would not be sitting here today talking about the things I was able to accomplish because of that. So,
Thanks, Brent.
a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I can speak on behalf for all of us. Thank you for sharing your story with
Absolutely.
us. And I think hearing you tell your story firsthand, in person, helps us all become more aware and educated and be able to learn from and with you. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So speaking of, you talked a lot about the help and the support of your athletic administration. I'm going to turn now to Heidi. So speaking of firsthand, Heidi, in your bio I noted that you helped chair the equity committee at Carleton and wrote the transgender policy, helped write the transgender policy. Tell us what motivated you to develop this policy proactively?
Sure, it's a bit of a story.
Okay.
So I'll start with that. And I do want to thank Brent for that personal story because hearing one of the stories of a transgender athlete is how we originally started thinking about writing a policy at Carleton. And I think I should back up a little bit and talk about Carleton first. So we're a small liberal arts school about 45 minutes south of here. There's some Carleton alums sitting up there today. But we are definitely a liberal campus. We only have about 2,000 students and only about 20% are from Minnesota. About 7 years ago, as Nicole mentioned, I was asked to take on the role of Associate Athletic Director, Senior Women Administrator. And after about the first year in my administrative role, our athletic director said, okay, it's time now that we get to one of those gender equity inclusion forums. So the NCAA puts together an inclusion forum every year is what they call them now. At the time, it was a gender equity forum. My athletic director and I went to that forum, and we heard a trans athlete speak for the first time. And from that moment on, I just couldn't get it out of my mind that we needed to do something at Carleton because I knew that we had trans students on our club teams at that time. But I think as an administrator, I couldn't imagine having an athlete. I think about you having a positive experience, I think, with your administration. But I couldn't imagine an athlete wanting to play sports so badly, and we didn't have something in place for them to go through that. Because it's hard enough, I think, without there being a policy even in place. So we came back from that conference, and you don't just sit down and start writing. And I'm not necessarily an expert, but I have written a policy. So, I have, business degrees and definitely not the PhD that Dr. Crane has. But we came back from that conference, and the first thing I did was meet with someone on campus who was an expert, and that was the director of our Gender and Sexuality Center. She was wonderful, and she's the one who said, yeah, you need to get going on this because you do have more and more club sport athletes, and their club sport and intramural and rec sports are also governed under our athletic department, under one department. So we did oversee all those students. And from that meeting, we basically walked over to our president's office and got into his office and had a meeting with him and said, first of all, we need to learn more about Title IX and gender equity on our campus and specifically in our department. So I asked if I could start an equity committee. So that committee, at the time, we had fundraising money coming in, we needed to divvy up. There were a bunch of other things in our department that needed to be done correctly and equitable. And so that was one of the jobs of that committee. But the other one was to start a transgender policy. I think what I learned out of that was it wasn't something that you could, like I said, just sit down and start writing. As Brent mentioned, the NCAA only had one resource out at that time, and that was the 2011 policy, and it still is the one policy that they have. So to think of him going in and going through that policy, it took us 2 years to write our policy, because we would come up with a draft and then we would send it to our gender equity director, and she would meet with students in her office and they would read through it and see, does this make sense? Does it flow? Is it the right thing to do? And we would get their comments back and we would rewrite. And once we did get the policy finally in place, we knew that we needed to do some educating. So we on the committee had been going through it for 2 years. We read through manuals. We found at that time that there were only 3 other policies that I could find in the whole country. I wish I had known that you guys were working on it, because that was about the same time. But online or in calling other colleges, there was nobody else that had one. And the NCAA only had that little guidebook that you could look through. So we borrowed all the language out of that, and we tried to adjust it to Carleton, and we also added in club sports and rec sports as well, and I can talk a little bit about that later. But once we did get our policy in place, we had some steps to actually make sure our student athletes knew about it. So the first thing we did was we printed off our manual, we printed off our policy, and we had the first department meeting that we had each of our coaches leave the meeting and say, this is your homework. You have to read it before we have our next department meeting. They did, and the next meeting that we came back to, we had the director of our Gender and Sexuality Center throw up a PowerPoint. The NCAA actually had a PowerPoint that we could use, and she had created her own. And similar to what you saw up here, we talked about pronouns. We have an 85-year-old coach, and we had someone who was just out of grad school. So the younger ones tended to kind of understand what was going on, and we had a lot of questions from some of our older coaches. So it just took some time, and we definitely wanted to create a safe space so that they could feel comfortable asking any question whatsoever. There was no silly question. We wanted everyone to feel like they could talk about it. From there, we went and put our policy on our website, and our Gender and Sexuality Center has a really great resource if you're looking for more resources about transitioning. On our website, they linked their website to ours so that students could find that even if they weren't an athlete at that time. From there, we had to educate our student athletes. So that started with, all of you know what compliance meetings are, and you go through all of those. We have them at Carleton too, we're Division III. So every compliance meeting that we had with our student athletes involved a slide about what a transgender policy meant, where they could find it, and if they had questions that they could feel safe and comfortable coming to either the athletic director or I to talk about that. From there, we put it, like I said, we put it on our website, and then we tried to bring in some people who could educate our student athletes. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Athlete Ally, but it's a great organization. We got funding from our conference office, and then I went around to other campus offices and got other funding from our Title IX office, our Director of Student Life, and they came to campus and talked to our student athletes. Athlete Ally is run by a former Division I wrestler who is an ally of the LGBTQ community, and he has a great message for athletes talking about inclusion and diversity. They met with our captains, and they met with our entire student body, all of our student athletes. And then we had another session in which they presented to our Division of Student Life and all of our coaches. And again, that was a smaller group because our campus is only 2,000 people. So we were able to ask questions, and coaches were able to get more answers and talk about it with student life because we work so closely together with our athletes. So we have about 370 athletes. So that's how our policy got started. And I know I can go into a few more detail on some things, I think, with some other questions that'll be coming up here, but it's exciting to see that we now have, I believe, 3 schools in our MIAC conference out of our 13 schools that have a transgender policy, and I know we've got our conference office representation here too tonight, and they created the first conference policy for transgender student athletes as well. So we have a lot of great resources and some direction for when we do have transgender athletes. And I just finished by saying we have had a varsity Division III student athlete who was transgender, and so we did go through that process. And I can speak a little bit about that as we get moving, but I also want to make sure that I protect that athlete's confidentiality, because that was a big thing in our policy too, to make sure that we adhere to that athlete's wishes. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Heidi. Brent, I'm just going to do a quick follow-up question to you. So you mentioned, looking back as your experience as an athlete, it was hard, but you felt you had support from the administration. coaches, perhaps, maybe not. But what was helpful for you as an athlete from the people in charge around you that made it easier?
Sure. Well, just the fact that they even heard me out in the first place was helpful in and of itself. I casually admitted to my coach at one point that I was, trans, and that I didn't identify as a female. I identified as a male at that point. And so, obviously, since this was a brand new thing, just the fact that they even heard what I had to say and were respectful about it in the first place, I think, was just a milestone in and of itself. That they actually cared. Because this was so revolutionary, they at least wanted to sit down and just kind of talk about what this means, since no one had done it before. But a lot of the administrators are what we call safe zone trained, meaning that they have some sort of training as to how to be respectful and inclusive to those who are LGBTQ in the athletic world. So having that sort of background and just their desire to keep me in my sport in some way, shape, or form, I think was helpful. The fact that they were trained, they were respectful about it, they heard me out, and they wanted to keep me eligible. They wanted me to play my sport, I think, were probably the biggest reasons that it was so successful.
Great. And I think it's important to note that, BGSU and Carleton are sort of at the forefront of and leading this charge. There are other institutions across the country, but this is by no means like the standard operating status quo. We're hoping maybe we get there, but we have a long way to go. Vicki, as one of the kind of preeminent scholars on transgender athletes, what are some of the common questions you get when you speak about transgender athletes, and how do you respond with a scholarly kind of informed response to those questions?
A lot of it is really just a lack of understanding, not having the background, not having had an opportunity to learn more about it. So a lot of it is thinking about how transgender people challenge the binary. And when you think of sports, like I said before, you have men's sports, boys' sports, girls and female sports. And, well, now what? How do we work with people that don't identify in either camp? And one thing I probably should have said earlier, there are some trans people that are very comfortable fitting into binary male-female post-transition, but there's a lot also that are somewhere in between. And so how do we create opportunities for people that don't want to fit in? So from a scholarly perspective, one is trying to break down these binaries, challenge every day what I now call folklore. We assume, and Brent alluded to this, that people with more testosterone are going to be bigger, stronger, better athletes, i.e. males are more privileged in sport than female because their testosterone makes them better athletes. So the folklore goes.
5'7", just so you guys know. I'm not very tall.
But we also know, like Brent said, so the policy is one drop of testosterone, you go to the men's team. And clearly the body is not changing that quickly. So how do we, both from a scholarly perspective, how do we conceptualize something different than just these two categories? And it's easy for me as a scholar to sit back and go, well, that's easy. There's just these people that don't fit in and we need to recognize them, but that doesn't work so well in practice. So I think the bridging the two, the scholarship to the practice. So from the scholarly perspective, breaking down the binary, looking at the challenges, recognizing where is the policy not working and how do we understand it, and then working with the policy to figure out, okay, now that we're understanding it, how does that help us to be more inclusive, be more compassionate to the trans people wherever they might fall and wherever they might be comfortable in sport.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of mentioned this folklore or maybe, false assumptions about trans athletes. Can you speak to this kind of assumption about the unfair competitive advantage of male to female trans athletes and how you typically respond to that?
Sure. One of the big assumptions is that if you are born a male, you will inherently have a competitive advantage that's going to carry over with you when you transition to become a female. all of the physiological studies and the hormonal studies that have been done, the medical studies, that after a year of being on hormone therapy, a trans female is hormonally and physiologically very similar to a cisgender female. So yes, there's a period of time where, sure, you still have, the testosterone and the strength, but a year after being on hormones, the strength is much more consistent with other women of your size and your sport and things of that sort. And so the research doesn't support that follows with you. One of the interesting things is we hear about Renee Richards, who was the transgender tennis player who transitioned in the 70s. And she now says that she does not think it's fair for trans women to compete with cisgender women because she thinks they continue to carry over this advantage. And if you put that historically, in the 1970s, men and women were trained so incredibly different in sport. Yeah, if you were trained as a male, you did have a competitive advantage because you were given better equipment, better training, which is not today's world anymore. So in today's world, that advantage doesn't follow through. So some of it, again, is that assumption that males are going to make better athletes, and that's never going to go away. There's some other stereotypes that we might get into later that follow, particularly trans men. When we think about transitioning, that follow particularly trans women. When we think about trans men, it's assumed, well, you started in a female body, you're not going to be any threat to going to a men's team, so yeah, you just go over there and we're not going to. The rules surrounding trans men are much more lax in some ways, or at least the stereotypes about them, because you're not starting from a position of privilege or expected advantage, whereas the trans women tend to face a lot more stereotypes placed upon them because of that.
And scrutiny. So, I think most scholars and advocates believe that allowing transgender athletes to participate on a team that corresponds with their gender identity is in the best interest of the athlete. And we've been talking about the collegiate level. But I think this is, there's some in the room that perhaps are at the youth or at the high school level. What is kind of the current, you talked about the NCAA policy and that it's there. We can talk about maybe its limitations in a minute, but what it really, and this is to open to anybody, what is really the current state of transgender athlete policies? We know at the NCAA, but what about the high school and the youth level?
I'll take that. They're all over the place, to be perfectly honest. If you're looking at youth sport, which typically we think of as 18 and under, but let's talk about prepubescent youth sport. What difference does it make what team the child plays on? Because physically, they're really identical. There's probably more differences among the group of boys or the group of girls than between the two. So at that age, let them play, let them learn the sport, and I don't see why. But again, there's concerns, because we still hear of situations where a little girl looks too much like a boy, so she gets called out. And there was recently a soccer team that was eliminated from a tournament because one of the little girls looked too much like a boy, and they said, nope, you're breaking the rules, you're a boy on the girls' team, and it wasn't. So there's still a lot of just stereotypes that guide this. But from just an absolute physiological, physical, at the really young ages, it shouldn't matter. High school, obviously, post-puberty, we start to see different sizes. I'm still a real strong advocate of let people be where they're comfortable, follow their gender identity, compete in the category, because unfortunately you still have to pick a category, but compete in a category where you feel comfortable. Because what's the purpose of high school sport? It's not to create Olympians. It's to teach a lot of life lessons, and yes, help you get better at your sport along the way. So what bigger life lesson than to learn to be compassionate about people different than yourself? And one thing I always like to point out is when we look at transgender athletes, there are a lot of obstacles in their way. Transitioning and being transgender is hard enough just to be different. And now they're trying to stay in their sport and compete and fighting various barriers and people that don't want them there. Now you're talking about people that have overcome incredible barriers, who are incredibly resilient. That's who I want on my team. That should not be the people we're kicking off the team. So I think the life lessons at the high school level are much bigger for inclusion. And I always say, who are we trying to protect? obviously the majority don't need the protection, that we should be trying to be more inclusive and protect the people that feel a little bit different or that aren't getting the support in other areas. So did I answer your question?
And I was looking around, trying to get up to speed on some of the policies around the country, and I just Googled trans athlete policies, and there's a really nice infographic of states by color, whether they don't have any policy, they have a policy and it's limiting, it's a policy and it's inclusive, or there's none. So if this is of interest to you, to really see the diversity around the country in terms of like no policy to a really well structured policy, there is an infographic on that. So speaking of the policies then, what are some of the, I know on our conference call we talked about this, so Brent or Heidi or both or all of you, what are some of the limitations or the critiques of these policies? You guys can do rock, paper, scissors if you want.
Right. Well, I would say, probably as I mentioned in my own personal experience, that, like I said, literally after taking one dose of testosterone, they're like, yep, can't compete on a women's team anymore, goodbye. And I was like, yeah, I feel no different. So I don't understand what the whole issue is what that is. And so I think that is probably one of my biggest critiques of that policy is that taking one dose of a hormone simply does not do anything. I mean, think about how many years it takes for you to go through puberty. So the same thing here. I mean, although it's a little bit accelerated and you reach all the milestones in like 1 year as compared to like maybe a few, it's the same general concept. I mean, you don't go from a boy to a man overnight. You don't go from a girl to a woman overnight. And so I think that kind of made it difficult because I think I think most people could probably agree that they would prefer to have a little more time on their previous team to get up to speed so they can prepare themselves. But yeah, one drop, that won't do anything.
Heidi?
Yeah, I think we actually still have conversations about it at Carleton. What about the NCAA policy? As I don't know if you remember, Brent mentioned, it's since 2011 is when that policy was created. Our athletic director at Carleton is actually on the Division III Management Council, so he tries to ask some of those questions. Are there any updates? Do you have any new manuals? Do you have any changes in policy? I know they're discussing whether or not to let transgender student athletes still practice with their teams, and you are allowed to do that now, but you still can't compete. So I don't know, I think that we're still waiting to see what the NCAA, we all chose to be a part of that association, and we do have to follow their rules. So it's hard. Our policy also is for our club sport athletes on our campus, which is the policy that anyone can compete on any team that they identify with unless their governing body has some kind of a rule. So, and there are none just yet. Rugby is trying to figure one out. Ultimate Frisbee is big at Carleton. They don't have anything. So we just adopted the most inclusive policy that we could. And then we also have intramural and rec programming, and that is, again, it's all co-ed anyway, so pick a team. We'll be on whatever team you want to be on. So, but until we hear something different from the NCAA, we still have to follow what their rules are.
And can I jump in?
Yeah,
and
please.
Some of the policies for children, for younger athletes, are things like you have to show your birth certificate. And if your birth certificate has been changed, then you can be on the team that you feel comfortable on. Well, that costs money. And that means access. And that means, what about immigrants? Do they have their birth certificates with them? Or looking at their legal name. Well, again, that costs money. So a lot of the things, it sounds really simple. Oh, just go change your birth certificate. Well, it's not always so straightforward. The new Olympic policy, one of the components for a trans male is to show that you have lived as a female with your gender identity. Am I saying that right? No, as a male, I'm sorry, for a trans male, lived as a male under that identity for 4 years. Well, look at some of these Olympians. Some of them are only 18 years old, so you have to be able to demonstrate and document from a very young age that you've been doing this that may or may not be all that easy. So even though there's some policies that seem to make sense, oh yeah, that makes sense, someone should be consistently living, but it's not so easy to necessarily document them, have the legal change, and then start thinking outside of the United States. I had an amazing opportunity to spend some time with a Ugandan trans male athlete. It's illegal to be LGBT in Uganda. And he's out and incredibly brave in working with LGBT sport, but he's never going to get a legal name change. They'll put him in jail first. I mean, so you have to think even beyond just our country, particularly when you're looking at Olympic sport and international sport.
And Brent, last night at dinner when we were talking, I think one thing that you mentioned is, and I had never thought about this, and I know that Amy Wilson and the Office of Inclusion for the NCAA does care very deeply about this, but the NCAA is real busy with lots of things right now. That's a different distinguished lecture. But you mentioned that, predominantly these policies have been made by cisgender people for trans people without consultation of trans people. So do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, and I think, it's obviously very important, and it's huge that the NCAA even made a policy for trans people, but it's sort of an afterthought, right? I mean, it's kind of just like, yeah, sure, here's a policy, all right, you guys can compete now, great, leave us alone, because one dose of testosterone is you can't play on the women's team anymore. So the policy, it's good that they even bothered to create one in the first place. But our understanding of transgender people and athletes in general, it's evolving. It's a fairly recent visible phenomenon within society to be a transgender person. So you can't just make one size fits all policy that you are going to expect to just work for every single person and just never change those policies. And as you mentioned, yeah, they were created by cisgender people for transgender people. So that's obviously, if you're not getting the input from the people that's affecting, then your policies probably aren't very good. And so that's why I say it's kind of just we made one just to make one so people will go away. At least trans athletes can participate, so what's the big deal type thing. But certainly it could use some improvements, and my biggest suggestion would probably be maybe consulting trans people. What a concept. But.
And Heidi, can you speak to the benefits of, we're kind of critiquing the policies, but what are the benefits of having the policy?
Sure. I think we've seen a lot of the benefits at Carleton already. First of all, I had mentioned that we added it to our compliance talk and a lot of the information that we want to get out to our student athletes at the beginning of their season. And that opened up some discussion, but it also let them know where we stand on inclusion and diversity within our own athletic department. And I think we as administrators have to model that and have to be willing to work on that, whether we have transgender students on our campus or not. Other ways that it has opened doors at Carleton, for example, after this policy came out, there was a task force that was put together as we started to talk more about pronoun use, as Dr. Crane had mentioned. So I was on a task force that basically has put into action, we're hoping that sometime soon this will happen, that a lot of our systems that we use on campus to store the data of our athletes, actually of all of our students, will go through some changes so that a student who goes through a name change, when their advisor looks at their file, they don't have their birth given name on there. They can identify with what they want to identify as. They can have their pronouns on there. We have faculty members who have asked us, I have a student in my class and I don't know what to say. And so we want to be able to keep having these discussions with our own faculty, our own coaches even, to be able to use pronouns, to get in the habit of using that. And so the transgender policy and that creation in our athletic department has opened a lot of other discussions on our campus. And so not only with the data that we use for our student athletes, for our students, but also for our student athletes. So now we start thinking about what kind of data are we collecting from them when we're filling out recruiting forms? Are we listing them as list your mother and your father, or are we listing parent one, parent two? So there's a lot of other things that have opened our eyes that we need to make some changes, even on our own campus.
Yeah, kind of challenging those status quo systems of heterosexism that kind of perpetuate the problem. What are maybe the harmful or negative consequences of not having a policy?
Total fear by the administrators.
Total fear.
Yeah, I came back from that inclusion forum. I was like, if we have an athlete, we don't know what we're going to do. And I don't think that's cool. I mean, I think that I would love for anyone, I had a great experience as a college athlete, and you know, that's one of the best things being a coach is getting to be around student athletes who love what they're doing and getting to be a part of their lives during their 4 years at college. And so the thought of a student coming in and not having anything in place, you think about legal issues, you think about what that says about you as an administrator. I'm not planning ahead, or I'm not thinking about my student athletes. I'm not staying up on the times and trying to see what's out there and what's being talked about. So not having a policy, I'll be honest with you, that's when I came back from that inclusion forum, I had a lot of fear, like, we don't have anything in place. I do not know what I would do. So I didn't want to mess that up, to be honest with you, so.
I also think we need to think of it from the athlete's perspective, the fear in the athlete when nobody talks about this. Think about the process of coming out for a lesbian or gay person. I can come out to my best friend, or I can come out to just my coach, or in order to come out as trans, this is big. You can't just suddenly appear on another team and not tell people why. So you have to come out, and part of this is NCAA policy. The way the system works is obviously your coaches need to know, obviously your teammates need to know, your athletic trainers need to know because you have to get a medical exemption for the hormones. Your administrators need to know. You had to write a letter to the athletics director. You pretty much, it's like all or none. I mean, it's scary enough coming out, and then if there's nothing that says we're going to support you, people assume the worst. And it's a really scary thing thinking, what if I do this and they throw me out? Or what, you know, just the not knowing. So when there's a policy in place, it's like, oh, someone's thought about this. Okay, there's a way for me to do this. It's not that, I would assume that means there's going to be some support somewhere. And just something to think about, there's been some recent research specifically with lesbian athletes, but when asked about support of administration, the athletes reported that if there was one administrator that they felt safe talking to, that made their experience all the different. It just takes one person that makes it clear that they create a safe space to open the door for people feeling more comfortable. So for those of you out there to be an ally, being one ally is really important. And obviously we hope there's a lot more than that, but that's, I mean, again, I think we also need to put it in the perspective of how does the policy or lack of a policy affect the student athletes.
Right. And I think, Heidi, to have the foresight and the being proactive to develop the policy in advance of having an athlete who wanted to transition instead of, you know, it's like you built it, they will come, instead of they're here and now what do we do? I think that's a real a nugget of wisdom for those in the room who are thinking about this. Do you have anything to add to that? Maybe kind of best practices for those who want to do what you've done?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think now there's more and more policies out there. Like, I want to go look and see what you guys did at Bowling Green. So, and I mentioned that, like, our conference has one. And I think I've had lots of schools call or email me and say, how did you do this? Went to the Women's Leadership, Women Leader Sports Conference and had a lot of my cohorts ask, can I get a copy of that? Because we've talked about it, we just haven't gotten to that point yet. And I would also recommend, just as whether it's students or administrators, just finding a resource on your campus. For us, it was our Gender and Sexuality Center. They were more than happy to help us. They are working with transgender students all the time. And for us to reach out to them, to get input from them, they came in and did educational sessions with our staff. We made sure that our student athletes had all the resources. It's actually listed right underneath our policy. These are other resources on campus. So I think that you just need to go out and ask questions, close the door, and not be afraid to ask anything so that you learn about it and read other policies, read Dr. Crane's work, go out and, you know, learn as much as you can so that you have maybe more compassion, more understanding, so that you can do what's right.
Yeah. And when I was trying to find an athletic administrator to serve on this panel and did some phone calls, all fingers pointed to Heidi Jane. So you're a real ally in the community, so thank you. Got some Carlton love in the back there. So a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A to the audience. Brent, Vicky, Heidi, what advice would you give to those of us in the audience who are learning and curious and, maybe a little tentative, don't want to be offensive or sort of learning? Like, what advice would you give?
I'm an academic, read.
Fair enough.
But there's a lot written out there you can find things online. There's transathlete.com, which provides a lot of policy information for people looking from that perspective. Some of the Athlete Ally, You Can Play also have information about transgender athletes. But there's also a fair amount of scholarly work written for everything from aimed at high schoolers through aimed at college students through aimed at people that study this stuff like I do. So there are a lot of resources. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Talk to those of you that are in school, those of you here on campus. You've got great resources with the Tucker Center. Find them, ask them, send them emails. But find the people that you can go to ask questions that can guide you to more resources.
I guess I would just say not necessarily only tied to like transgender athletes, but just transgender people in general. Just trying to be mindful. I think a lot of times trans people become spectacles and everything just becomes focused on their bodies, surgeries, hormones, whatever, et cetera. But like, we're still people at the end of the day. We have more to our lives than just being trans. Yeah, I'm a trans person, but it's just one facet of my life. I don't wake up every day and think, yeah, I'm trans, cool. I just get up and like start my day, you know what I mean? It's something that I encounter every now and then, but it's not like the main focus of my life. And so there's a right way and a wrong way to ask people questions. It's certainly important to educate yourselves, especially as they've said, in this day and age, there's so many resources out there, not just on your campus, but online. You can simply Google questions and chances are you'll find thousands of answers to other people who have wondered the same thing. So even if you don't know a trans person in real life, there's ways to still find out the answers to your questions online. But just being mindful that trans people are more than just their bodies, more than just their transitions. And so certainly there's no harm in asking people questions about their transitions, but I guess just being mindful how you're asking them and what you're asking them. If you feel like it might be kind of targeting or an inappropriate question, then yeah, probably don't ask it because I've certainly received a fair share of offensive questions in my lifetime, but just being mindful, I suppose.
Good. Heidi?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything much different than that other than, again, just seek help, ask people, look up information, don't be afraid to ask. I can tell a story. This morning I was taking my 12-year-old daughter to school, and it said, I won't be home tonight, I'm going to be speaking at something. Oh, what are you speaking at? And I told her I'm speaking about our transgender policy, and I said, do you know what that means? And she goes, yeah. And she rattled off, it's someone, who maybe doesn't feel like what they were born, and it's hard. It's not like they would just do that on purpose, Mom. And I was like, yeah, my 12-year-old daughter understands it. And it was just that I didn't know that when I was 12, and I think about, there a lot, our generation has changed, and don't be afraid to talk about it with people to learn more about it. The more we learn, the more people we get to know, the better educated we can be, the kinder we can be, the more lovable we can be, and I think that, you guys are athletes and love sports. We want other people to have that same kind of experience, so I think we just need to do our job too.
Yeah. And I think I think the power of this panel is to bring these issues to the forefront and talk about it openly and help people get the language and the concepts and to hear the stories firsthand. A colleague of mine here on campus is looking at some of the Minnesota student survey data here in Minnesota, and there's a question in there about the percentage of youth in our high schools in Minnesota that identify as trans or gender nonconforming. And, when she shared the statistic with me, and we have an infographic of that data out on the table, I saw someone in the front row over here had a copy of it, but in Minnesota, in youth grades 9 and 11, 2.7% of our high school youth in Minnesota identified as trans or gender nonconforming. So if you extrapolate that out to all the students in high schools in Minnesota, that's about 10,000 youth. and there was no differences between the metro area and the outstate areas in terms of prevalence. So I think when I saw that and I was thinking about this panel, I thought, you know, this is something, whether we know a trans person now, maybe we do, but we're not sure we do, but it's coming to the forefront, and we need to be prepared as educators, as coaches, as administrators, as trainers, and for those of us who work in educational contexts, this should be near the top of the list. So thank you for your comments and questions. Do you have any other sort of wrap up before I open it up to Q&A to the audience? No? Okay. So for the final segment of tonight's panel, looking in the back here, we have some mics. We're going to open it up for questions to the audience, and I know probably there's quite a few people that have questions. And I think to piggyback on Brent's advice is, you know, if you're like, oh, I don't know if this is inappropriate or not, then, you know, maybe just it is. But if you're not sure, you know, we're here to learn. So if you raise your hand, we'll bring you the mic. And as a moderator, what I would ask is that you be respectful and please ask a question rather than give your commentary, okay? So that we can have time for as many questions as we can to learn more from our panelists, which is why they're here. So who would like to start us off with a question? We've got, is that Jonathan and Anna are in the back? So just raise your hand and we'll come around. Is that Fred? Fred, always with the question. Lead us off.
My name's Fred. Brent, Brent, this one is kind of a little bit more geared towards when you were talking about when you took your first dose, you woke up the next morning, you're like, I don't feel a change. We talked a lot about policy, and then you brought up the point of the Olympics, you have to have that 4-year window. From an NCAA standpoint, do you feel that there should be like a time stamp on that? I know you felt like the transition was difficult going from the women's cross country team to the men's. Do you think you should put like a 2-year window on that, or like how do you feel that the policy should be laid out?
It's actually a really good question. And it's hard to say just because, I mean, by NCAA regulations, you know, you have 5 years to complete a 4-year season. So if you wanted to take like a 2-year like time frame to like adjust, I mean, you're automatically relinquishing 2 years of your eligibility. And most people want to play their sport as long as they possibly can. I mean, obviously you don't want to get injured, right? Like, you don't want to do anything that's going to impede your ability to play for as many years as you can. And so I think I've had the same question also. You know, I talked to some of my administrators about like, can I take like a 1-year time frame to like catch up with everybody else and just kind of transition, I guess, get my body together, because you know the acclimation period is hard. It's not easy, but there's no such thing that's in place to allow that. Simply because, like I said, the policy was created, you know, coming up on like 8 years or 7 years ago now, and so it hasn't changed from that point. And so I think that's something that they should look at. Actually, is how do we incorporate that, because everybody's body adapts to the transition differently. Whether you're taking, you know, testosterone or you're taking estrogen, people respond differently to that sort of thing. But I think it's a good idea to potentially look at that in the future for NCAA athletes so that people can actually get up to speed and then be able to play their sport how they want to play it when they want to play it.
I have an idea, throwing it out.
Let's hear it.
Okay, a trans red shirt.
Oh, yeah, okay. I mean, they have the concept of like a medical red shirt,
Okay.
but they make it extremely difficult to get that sort of thing. And it's usually for somebody who has like a very serious injury that requires some sort of surgery. But yeah, you have to like write some sort of petition as to why you should even get this medical red shirt. You can't just be like, hey, broke my hip, can I have a red shirt? They're probably gonna be like, yeah, well, let's see some documentation. So you don't just like extend your eligibility for whatever reason if you don't need to.
Right, interesting. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Got one down here and one over here. Go there and then.
Hello,
down here.
my name is Katie Freeman. I'm one of the faculty at the medical school, and I'm very interested in how exercise is effective for things like depression and anxiety that tend to be more pronounced in trans folks. Do we have any data yet looking on the, effectiveness of participation in sports for dealing with some of those struggles that can often be more present in our trans athletes?
There's qualitative research on that. A couple very recent studies have come out in the last 2 years, 2 different studies that when, particularly for trans men, part of the transition is becoming more muscular, getting a more male shape, and then for trans women, obviously changing the shape of their body to be more feminine if that's what they desire. And exercise is huge in being able to do that. And so staying involved in exercise seems to be something that's really helpful during the transition, whether it's competitive sport or whether it's exercising. And the little bit of qualitative data we have shows that that also, at the same time, does help with depression and anxiety. So small scale studies, because we don't have huge populations at this point, but there is a little bit of evidence showing that absolutely staying involved, particularly someone who is physically active, to continue to stay physically active. The biggest impediment is the locker room. If you're a swimmer, the only way you can get to most pools is to have to go through the locker room, and if you're mid-transition, pre-transition, that can be a really scary, sometimes not even a safe space to walk through. And then locker rooms tend to be, whether it's, and interestingly, there's some of this qualitative data shows, one, there's the concern that I shouldn't be in the locker room as a trans person. There's that whole thing that we've heard way too much about. But some trans people recognize that I don't want to also make my teammates uncomfortable. And if the locker room does not have spaces where you can just go behind a curtain and close yourself off for anybody who's uncomfortable changing in front of other people, it makes that very difficult. So the locker room is a huge impediment, but if we can help physically active people stay physically active, it's very helpful. And I have those references written down if you want to.
Hi, I'm Tori. So with the NCAA, obviously it sounds like they need to update their policy since it was written so long ago. So Brent, being a trans person and going through this and being a trans athlete as well, if you were to be consulted on a new policy, because you were saying that they should be like consulting people who have gone through this or this is something that is affecting their lives. If you were to be consulted on a new policy, what are some changes that you would basically want to see or that you would want to see in the new policy for upcoming trans athletes?
Well, I think a lot of what the gentleman at the back asked as well. Probably my biggest thing and what was hardest for me was just the adjustment period. Putting your body through that, very difficult. And so I think just being able to give somebody a time window that doesn't somehow impede their eligibility as an athlete so they can just catch up and be with everybody else, I think would be crucial because, as Dr. Crane was just saying, being able to keep people playing their sport, absolutely very important. I thought there were multiple times where I would just quit because I was like, okay, this is too hard. Going through all the eligibility and everything is just making everything too difficult, but I was depressed with that sort of thing because obviously I wanted to compete, wanted to participate, but the rules make it hard to do so. And so I think it's also hard to say just because there's no one way to be trans. There's multiple ways to be trans. I'm just one case, one example. And so I think having it more of a case-by-case kind of basis, which is kind of what BG did for me. They kind of asked what I was looking for, even though they couldn't accommodate to every single wish that I had necessarily. I think basically just seeing what the athlete needs and giving them what it is that they're looking for, because somebody in my exact same position might also not be looking for what I was looking for. So I guess I would just say that having a case-by-case type of thing, talking to the athlete directly, and then perhaps looking at a window to get someone up to speed so they're not losing their eligibility.
So if you were saying that with a time frame of having just a little bit of a break, if you had been allowed to stay and compete with the women's team, would you still have wanted that break?
That's a good question. I guess I'd never thought of that. Probably not. I probably would not have wanted that break just because it would have given me some more time to just acclimate to how my body would now compete compared to what it was able to do before, and a little bit more I don't know, chill environment. Because like I said, obviously it was a big step from the women's to the men's team. So just being able to like figure myself out in an environment that was a little bit more like calm or I was familiar with probably would have, I don't know, made it easier for me to not want a break necessarily.
Maybe changing policy more on hormone.
Right.
Okay.
Jonathan, did you have a question over there?
Hi, thank you for being here. I have a question for Dr. Crane about kind of being an academic. So as an academic, in an area like this where there are so few experts, kind of how do you position yourself as a scholar or as an advocate, and kind of have you seen pushback from either the scholarly community or like the administrative and advocacy side about how you've positioned yourself?
I guess I've just been doing this for such a long time, they're used to me being on the edge of something LGBT. But I mean, I think earlier in my career, it was a little more scary, and it was a little more, I was really fortunate that the people that mattered around me, my director, my chair, the administrators were incredibly supportive. I can't say that all of my colleagues at that point in time were happy to have me doing this kind of research. And I mean, in the political climate, sometimes there's been, in the state of Ohio, they have sometimes possible bills coming that you can't talk about certain topics in classes, including LGBT things, which was like, you're gonna make me illegal to talk about what I've been researching for the last 20 years. It's kind of scary at times. So I mean, in terms of as a young scholar, sometimes it's a little scary going into an area that is a little more controversial. I found with some of my former graduate students, it's actually opened doors that they want someone doing diversity work, however you describe that. So it's going to depend on the people around you. And I'm in a space right now that I work with amazing people that have been very supportive, from our dean up to our president, of the type of work that I do. And I've been there long enough to kind of create, and there's not just me, but there's enough other scholars across different disciplines doing this type of work that it is safe for us to do that. We'll talk.
That's a good question. We have time for one more. Where are we?
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Crane. Well, first of all, thank you all for raising an awareness to this need for transgender athletic policies. Thank you so much for that. I do have a question for Dr. Crane. You said that there's folklore that hormone levels equate to advantage or disadvantage among athletes. That folklore comes from the research from Dr. Joanna Harper, who is a consultant for the International Olympic Committee's policy for transgender athletes, who they adopted that in order to determine thresholds for T levels in both, at least female trans athletes. Can you describe the data that has disproven that?
Oh, I could go on for days. There's not tons of it, I'll be honest. Well, here's what we do know. And I'm not saying that people with high testosterone, that there aren't some advantages, because, I mean, there's some research. I mean, we know that males are bigger and stronger on average than females on average, and testosterone is a big part of that. What we don't know is that the only reason. And if we look specifically in just female athletes, if we look at the Olympics, and they've been sex testing, gender verification, it's gone through a variety of names, consistently, when they test hormones, they find that there are some females that have exceptionally high levels of testosterone that is non-functional. Their bodies can't process testosterone. So there are quite a few, not huge numbers, but there's a number of women that have been identified as having some intersex condition in which they produce high levels of testosterone, their body doesn't do anything with it, so it's non-functional, and yet they're Olympic level athletes, which to me says testosterone is not the one thing that gets you there. We also know there's a large number of male athletes with unusually low levels of testosterone, and they're still Olympic athletes. So I'm not saying that people, I mean, certainly testosterone plays a role in it, but the current policy in testing only female athletes' testosterone levels, and if it hits a certain level, now you have to compete in the men's division. This is an Olympic level policy. to me, it's like, well, we're not saying, well, you're exceptionally tall. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be on your basketball team, and you have an unfair advantage because you're that much taller than me. Well, you do, but it's not cheating. You just grew that way. And it's the same thing with testosterone levels. If we're not talking doping, we're not talking you're somehow taking steroids, taking testosterone outside of your body. It's one of a whole lot of innate things that make athletes exceptional. So that's where, and when I say folklore, what I should say is it's kind of, we're just so used to the assumption that because we assume that high testosterone is what's created high-level athletes, we haven't stopped to think about, wait, what's the alternative? Maybe there's other things we need to be looking at as well. We just kind of fall back on that because that's a comfortable narrative that we're used to. So I think, without going on and on about this, which I could, I think it's one of the things that make athletes exceptional, but I have a really hard time pointing to that's the one thing that should lead to someone being excluded when we don't look at, and we don't test it in men. So, I'm sorry, in the NBA, I guarantee there are some men that are exceptionally big, that are abnormal, might have some genetic difference that led to that, but nobody cares because they're men and that fits masculinity. When we're talking with the women's side, there's a lot more concerns. And I just think we need to look more broadly than just the one touchstone.
I think that's a great question to end with and a good exemplar of how this is a very complex discussion. And so I'm going to wrap up there in the interest of time. So would everybody please join me in thanking our panelists? And with that, I conclude tonight's distinguished lecture. Thank you for being here. Please join us in the lobby for some refreshments and check out the resource table. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was a good time. Yeah. Yeah, I can't believe it. Geez, it's already run 2 hours. I'm trying to